We saw China and Russia get married on February 4th, 2022 at the Beijing Olympics, right? That handshake is the one China policy. Now see that seed sprouting into Cold War II.
So you stated that China is at the center of Cold War II. Why do we have to focus on China?
Cold War got the hottest, it was in Korea, it was in Vietnam, it was in Southeast Asia, it was in China's periphery, not Russia's periphery. Maybe we didn't ever understand what the First Cold War was about. If the U.S. is the only economy big enough to stand up to China, otherwise we're all going to end up living on planet China.
Is it truly necessary or even possible for Korea to choose just one side?
안녕하세요, 스텔라입니다. 전 세계 화제의 책과 저자를 깊이 있게 들여다보는 시간 스텔라의 북인사이트. 오늘도 흥미로운 게스트를 모셨습니다. 요즘 뉴스에서 전쟁이란 단어가 자주 들리죠. 이 반도체 전쟁, 에너지 전쟁, 사이버 전쟁, 우주 전쟁, 그리고 최근에 관세 전쟁까지. 이제는 총 대신에 이 공급망 기술, 무역 관세가 무기가 된 것 같아요. 이 통념을 좀 뛰어넘는 일들이 자주 일어나면서 이 불확실성이 좀 커졌다라는 얘기도 많고요. 딱 이럴 때 이런 저자랑 얘기를 해보면 좋지 않을까 싶어서 모셨습니다. 이 미국 국방성이랑 CIA의 전략자문을 맡고 있는 미래학자라고 하더라고요. 그럼 불확실한 미래에 대해 어떻게 생각하면 좋을지 좀 좋은 얘기를 들을 수 있지 않을까 싶고요. 그래서 오늘은 이 국내에선 제2차 냉전 시대라는 제목으로 나온 신간 Cold War II의 저자와 함께 이야기를 나눠보려고 합니다. 이 미국에서는 안보 경제 부문에서 이 아마존 베스트셀러에 올랐다고 하더라고요. 이 정치, 경제, 기후에 AI 기술까지 이 변화가 많은 이런 불확실한 세상에서 우리의 앞날에 대해서 어떻게 생각해보면 좋을지 오늘의 저자 제이슨 쉔커와 함께 이야기 나눠보겠습니다. Hi, Jason. How are you?
Good. Thank you very much for asking.
Can you briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. So I'm Jason Schenker. I'm the president of Prestige Economics and chairman of the Futurist Institute. I've written a number of books, many of which have been bestsellers in Korea, including Jobs for Robots, The Future After COVID, and most recently, Cold War II.
I heard that you authored around 37 books. Of these, many of them are Amazon bestsellers. And also you cover various topics like AI, economics, finance, and technology. What aspects of your work or ideas do you think people particularly appreciate?
I think there is a lot of information coming at people all the time. And probably I think the value that I bring in my books is helping people kind of distill all of that information down to kind of a big idea. What are the potential ways that we should think about that as impacting the future? And so I think that's the value I bring, is interpreting and distilling down a large swath of information to make it digestible, understandable, and actionable in terms of a response.
In your profile, I saw the word futurist. So for those who haven't heard of the job futurist, can you tell us what you do as a futurist? What does a futurist do?
Sure. So, and there's different kinds of folks who would describe futurists in different ways. As someone who is a classically trained econometrician in statistics, and this is something I've been doing for over 20 years. So economists look 24, 36 months out for currencies, commodities, interest rates, macroeconomic indicators, central bank policy, that kind of stuff. But beyond 3 years, sort of the tail end of the distribution of possibilities gets really wide and the uncertainty goes up. And the further out you go in the future, the tougher it kind of is to predict. And that's where you need new scenarios. And so futurists, in the way I view it and with what I do, I'm trying to help people think beyond the 24 to 36 month window at a longer term range of potential futures, as Jim Dator did, one of the kind of the pioneers in space around 4 futures, thinking about 4 different ways of scenarios, right? A continuation of trend, a reversal of trend, a plateauing of trend, or parabolic shift higher in the trend. So that's very different than how maybe most business people talk about trends, which is, mid case, high case, low case, right? So futurists are trying to help people think about the trends in technology, the economy, and demographics. How are those going to impact the long term? And what is a wider range of potential outcomes? And how do we think about what they could be? What are the important levers, drivers that get us to different scenarios? In my mind, that's what a futurist does, helping people think about the potential future in a very uncertain environment, usually along a longer time horizon, not just the next year or two.
Mm-hmm, I see. This sounded like you are doing a lot of qualitative works. Do you also conduct quantitative works as well?
Yeah, absolutely. As a classically trained econometrician, I forecast all kinds of macroeconomic indicators. Bloomberg News has ranked my forecasts number one in the world in 27 different categories since 2011. And so that's kind of where I do a lot of my quantitative work, is in that 24 to 36 month window out, looking at currencies, commodities, interest rates, policy, macroeconomic indicators. But when we talk about longer term factors that are impacted by policy, now you kind of need to move away from purely quantitative models. You can put probabilities on certain scenarios, but a lot of that has to be informed by expertise and not just by historical data. Because, if we're talking about various policies, that range of future outcomes may be wider than historical data might lead us to believe.
Okay, this interview will be released on YouTube. I like to ask you directly, why Cold War II?
Yeah, so I've been working on this for a number of years, and I've been advising clients on the geopolitical rising risk between the U.S. and China since 2017. And I've done work for the DoD going back to July of 2017. So doing a lot of work on the defense side. I was seeing a lot of things. Everything that's in the book, everything we're talking about today is unclassified. But I've been doing a lot of work in the defense space on these issues, and they continue to heat up. And Cold War II was really the scenario I saw us in, looking at the end of 2021, looking into 2022. Once we saw China and Russia get married on February 4th, 2022 at the Beijing Olympics, right? That's how I viewed the joint statement issue that you can find even today on the Kremlin website, where Russia and China said they strongly defend the outcomes of the Second World War and that there's no limit to their cooperation. And then just a few weeks later, we see Russia invade Ukraine. I don't think any of that is a coincidence. And so a lot of the work I've been doing already, we were generating these reports on the subject.
I see. Interesting. Does that mean that the U.S. government actually pay more attention to China around 2021, 2022?
Well, I think, you saw in the first Trump administration, there was a push against China with the Section 232 and 301 tariffs. Under the Biden administration, there was a further pushback against China with a continuation of those tariffs, as well as other executive orders restricting investments. And so you've seen the focus has been on China very squarely under the first Trump administration, which was a Republican administration, during the Biden administration, which was a Democratic administration, and now further under the Trump administration. And a lot of this pressure really is within the Beltway, the powers that be, the administration, Congress. It does seem very much that they anticipate China might try to make an aggressive move to gain control of Taiwan around 2027. That is the timeline around which some of these policies are pushing. And so it is my belief that in anticipation of the potential risk that China might seek to gain control of Taiwan, the U.S. is trying to present a more credible threat, right? Because if the U.S. can be a more credible threat to China, it can more effectively project deterrence. And even though you might say, well, the trade and the tariff things, all this stuff is very expensive, but it's infinitely cheaper in many ways than World War III would be. And if U.S. policies pushing on China can get China to rethink a timeline under which it might try to gain control of Taiwan by force, or if it may be able to get China to completely rethink gaining control of Taiwan by force, which obviously would be a best case scenario, that's worth doing. And that is what I believe we see in U.S. policies. It is an attempt to strengthen U.S. economic security and U.S. economic self-sufficiency, one of the two key parts of economic security, right? There's national security. Part of that's economic security. Economic security has two parts, economic power, right? But then there's economic self-sufficiency, which is the other part of economic power. And this is where the U.S. is weaker. And this is where the U.S. really needs to work with its allies to kind of hit above its weight class, right? By leveraging what it has in terms of alliances to further pressure China. And it is my belief that what we probably are going to see through all the tariff and trade negotiations now is the U.S. may be trying to advance U.S. economic and national security aims that allow for a boxing out of China, that allow for Chinese containment, and that there's likely to be pressure on U.S. allies to also pressure and box out and contain China and try to dissuade China from trying to take Taiwan by force. And that's, especially within such a tight timeline of 2027, that is, I think, what the administration is trying to do. Democrats, Republicans, they disagree about a lot of stuff. One of the things they don't disagree about is China and that need to prevent kinetic conflict over Taiwan.
So you stated that China is at the center of Cold War II. Why do we have to focus on China? And my next question is, when did you start paying attention to China?
Yeah, so thank you for asking the question. Obviously, China, as I've been an economist professionally since 2004, and China has always been something that's been critical, especially because I've been covering commodity markets since 2004, and China, as world's biggest manufacturer, has been a big driver of what goes on in commodity markets. So I've always been paying attention to China, but I think the focus of China as adversary really began more severely during and leading up to the first Trump administration. But I think there really was a laser focus of this once COVID happened, because supply chains of various goods that stretched into China were suddenly revealed to be insecure, that you couldn't get what you needed. PPE, medical devices, medicines, electronics, equipment, like whatever you needed, suddenly you just couldn't get it because it was in China, and that supply chain wasn't secure. And so this is part of the research I did for the Pentagon in June of 2020. China's been a great place for a lot of companies to make a lot of money for a long time. But once you really saw that shift in COVID, you saw that, well, it's a great place to make money, but it may not necessarily be a safe place or secure place to have your supply chain. And so the lack of security in the supply chain was revealed in that moment. And that really kind of changed policies, the further, I think further internal politics within China, where Premier Xi is now a premier for life, right? This is very different than what we had previously seen in China, but some of the power consolidation changes, I think those things also forced a U.S. re-examination of the political relationship with the U.S. and China. And the continued push and pressures on Taiwan in terms of air incursions, naval incursions, that these tensions between the China and the People's Liberation Army and Taiwan have increased over time. All of those things have been accelerating in not just a continuation, but an acceleration of tensions. I think those factors really made China a top concern.
Mm-hmm. I can see that. But the China actually pursued the Belt and Road Initiative for a very long time. How do you view China's initiatives like this, the Grand Initiative, and their recent changes and movements?
Yeah, when you look at China, a lot of what they're trying to do is what we've seen in the U.S., right? What we did at the end of the Second World War during Cold War I, we call soft power diplomacy, right? So China also is doing debt trap diplomacy, where China is essentially the bank for 70% of all emerging market debt, right? That's held by China. So China has used a mix of financial incentives and issuing debt to gain leverage over a number of different countries, especially where there are raw materials. This has been particularly effective in Africa in terms of gaining influence, bases, access to supplies of raw materials, right? So all of this is to kind of secure the Chinese factory floor, right? China's biggest manufacturer in the world. We need access to raw materials and supply chains. And again, this is a supply chain issue, right? A lot of Chinese policies are designed around this to use money to project influence in various ways, in various industries, in as many different ways as possible as we can imagine, and to secure those supply lines for Chinese manufacturing, which is so critical for the Chinese economy, for Chinese influence. And then obviously also trying to find other ways to gain influence globally.
There's so much uncertainty. I feel like what really matters is having the ability to make like rational predictions. So I think the more we understand your framework, the more takeaways that readers can find from your book. So my question is, when you tackle these subjects, what's your approach and how do you structure your thinking when you're actually building your argument?
And, this was the rising tension. I'm sure you're familiar with the book by Graham Allison, Destined for War, right? The Thucydides trap and rising powers and incumbent powers of conflict. I believe that came out in 2020. I had written in that Pentagon report that one of the scenarios that I viewed most likely was destined for proxy wars. Not that we would have direct conflict between the permanent members of the UN Security Council, France, England, the US, Russia, and China, like not a direct conflict between the principal nuclear powers that are the permanent members of the UN Security Council, but through proxies, which is what we see with Russia and in Ukraine and Iran and its terrorist proxies in Israel, and the risk we could see with China and Taiwan. It might not necessarily be the U.S. that gets directly involved, but the U.S. may be providing support because China and Russia and Iran and North Korea are increasingly working together in many, many different ways. So as I was thinking about this, a lot of it is kind of waiting for an inspiration moment. And one of the stories that I opened the book with, and this happened at the very beginning of last year. I was in Yorba Linda, California, and I was at the Nixon Library. And everywhere you go, there's the picture of Nixon shaking hands with Zhou Enlai in the tarmac in 1972, February of 1972, 50 months before Russia and China get married at the Beijing Olympics. It's the end of Cold War I, right? Or it's the end of the Cold War, right? And in that moment, I'm like, well, no, it's not the end of the Cold War. It's the end of Cold War I. And I started then thinking about that handshake is the one China policy. And that one China policy is the seed that is sown that ends Cold War I, but we now see that seed sprouting into Cold War II because now China wants that one China and the one China policy, which was so ambiguous before, and that was part of the handshake deal. It's been 50 years since the handshake, and China wants to cash that check. And so this is a moment where it just kind of occurred to me that maybe we got the Cold War wrong, right? Like I was born in the late 70s and I was raised during the Cold War and people talked about it was the Russians, it was the Russians. But, in hindsight, if we think about where the Cold War got the hottest, it was in Korea. It was in Vietnam. It was in Southeast Asia. It was in China's periphery, not Russia's periphery. And so maybe we didn't ever understand what the first Cold War was about, right? And Americans, Eurocentric, we think, oh, it's heavy about Russia. Well, maybe it wasn't. One conflict with a 50-year armistice to answer, not the Russia question, to answer the China question. How do you resolve China's propensity for military, political, and economic hegemony over Asia? And so as we think about the pushback that the U.S. is doing against China right now, I was asked about this very recently. Well, what else could I think of as a time like this? It also looks like the U.S. trade restrictions put on Japan before the U.S. was dragged into the Second World War when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And that was the U.S. cut off Japan of oil and steel and and that was, that part of World War II in the Pacific was Japan's propensity for economic, political, and military hegemony over That was World War II. And then after World War II, it was kind of about China and Asia. And it's still kind of it. And so that's interesting that this analogy kind of, it's all about Asia. There's been joint military exercises in the very recent past, the last couple of months, in overlapping international maritime waters between Korea and China. So you see that those risks, China has this big Navy, and it has some larger ambitions, it seems. And that's a risk for U.S. allies like Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, Japan. Like, this is a risk. And it's a significant risk, not just to our allies because they're our allies, but also for some of our most critical supply chains, thinking back to ICT industries, and how important that is, like Taiwan, Korea, truly, it does really impact the U.S. And while in Europe, the focus is on Ukraine and Russia, and I do believe that is another front of Cold War II. It might be the first front. The Israeli-Iranian front is the second front, and China and Taiwan is the third front.
I see. Then based on your argument in your book, how can we understand the recent U.S.-China, the competition, deglobalization kind of trend, and also the U.S. tariff? Do you think it will be successful?
In my opinion, the Trump administration is operating on a realpolitik framework where there's an outcome-driven motivation. What is the outcome? Well, the outcome is, well, it could be a bunch of different outcomes. It could be something that strengthens U.S. economy. It could be something that gets further pressure on China. It could be something that weakens China. It could be, we're getting geoeconomic or geopolitical concessions from our allies and trade partners who will also help us pressure China. There's many different potential outcomes. I don't think the administration has very specific goals, which is why I don't think they're following a specific process. They're outcome focused, not process focused, which is why for much of the world, this looks like a very uncertain and chaotic process, but it's an ongoing negotiation. And the goal is put the U.S. in a more advantaged position than China. Because the thing is, if the U.S. is the only economy big enough to stand up to China, the U.S. has to do it. Otherwise, we're all going to end up living on planet China. And I don't think that's anything anyone in the U.S. or Korea, Japan, Taiwan, almost any country wants. And that's, I think, what we're looking at here is a realignment of priorities. During this uncertainty, you're seeing other changes in policy that are strengthening U.S. and allied positioning. For example, after you had a kerfuffle, shall we say, with President Zelensky in the White House with President Trump and Vice President Vance, what happened? Well, Zelensky went to Europe. And suddenly, lots of European countries opened their checkbooks and wrote money. They're allocating more money, writing checks for more weapons. Actually, as U.S. allies, if they're going to spend more money on weapons, that's good, because that means, right, the U.S. and its allies in aggregate will be spending more money on weapons, right? The current bill in the U.S. legislature, which the administration is calling the Big Beautiful Bill, that also increases defense spending. So just to be clear, the U.S. is increasing defense spending and European countries are increasing defense spending. So the process, not good. Public dispute in the White House. No, doesn't look good. What's the outcome? U.S. allies buy more weapons to use against Russia and probably Russia's allies in this process, right? It's a deterrent. In the end, that's a positive, right?
Actually, from South Korea's perspective, this is a very real and very practical concern. So our relationship with the United States is crucial, but our closest neighbors are actually Japan and China. So with the rise of friendshoring, is it truly necessary or even possible for Korea to choose just one side?
I'm an outsider, but if you've got tens of thousands of American troops there helping to, provide security and military coordination, if your defense industry is integrated with NATO allies and U.S. and other allies, To me, this is very clear. China is a real risk and has engaged in the same naval posturing that it's used to, puff out its chest and present a credible threat to other countries in the region. So I think that U.S.-Korean relationship is very, very important. It is very, very strong. And of course, I'm based in Austin, Texas, and we see Samsung is building massive facilities here, is doing tremendous work here. So our economies work well together. Our defense industry is working, very closely together. Korean materiel is critical for lots of U.S. allied countries. So I think that relationship is very solid, and we would have to believe something very different for that to not be the case.
So another key question to Korean audience is that during the Biden administration, we saw the introduction of IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act. Now, under Trump administration, we're seeing a little bit of shift towards even more assertive industrial protection policies, like a revised CHIPS Act or new tariffs. Do you see these U.S. industrial policies targeting semiconductors and electronics as a more of a threat or an opportunity for South Korea?
Well, I think all of this is in flux. And if we think about the trade policies between the U.S. and tariffs, and this is all up for negotiation, I think and suspect that probably the administration wants Korea to divest its supply chain further from China, wants assistance in pressuring China, because after all, if Korea or Taiwan or any of the other countries in Asia would be at risk from Chinese military forces, asking for assistance in economic pressuring seems to be a small ask compared to what the future may require. And I think in the United States, there's going to be further incentives to encourage Korean and other U.S. allies to make investments, to build facilities in the United States, friendshoring not just in foreign countries, but our allies to build more facilities in the United States to help us wean ourselves off of China. And that will further strengthen our relationship. So I think whether we see in the future Republican or Democratic administrations, this tension with China, I don't see going away. I see that continuing to rise. The form in which we see a working relationship and incentives for Korean companies to work with the U.S., for the governments to work together, for research, for technological sharing, for investments in cross-border trade, the administration, I think, and Congress in the United States are looking at is 2027 is the year they believe China wants to take forceful control of Taiwan, and that is 18 months from now. So that's right around the corner, and maybe you don't have effective deterrence, and then you end up in a conflict. So I don't exactly know how all the trade negotiations and investment policies are going to work out, but I do believe this is the fundamental driving vision, which is project effective deterrence to prevent a kinetic conflict with China. In the last year of the Second World War, the United States allocated 40% of its GDP to weapons and materiel. Today, 40% of U.S. GDP is $12 trillion. So this is what we're all trying to avoid, not just obviously massive loss of life from kinetic conflict. There's a technological iron curtain that's been falling between the United States and China for years. But if there's a kinetic conflict that breaks out because China blockades Taiwan, you're going to have economic amputation at the global level.
I see. Yeah. And I also find that the tech race between the US and China is really heating up, especially in AI and robotics. What do you think is the most underestimated technology or a tech trend in this US-China tech rivalry right now?
Well, look, there's three ways you get economic growth, and this is a Nobel Prize winning theory, the solo growth model, right? There's capital, there's labor, there's technology. Technology is one of those key elements of economic growth, a big productivity lever, right? We see it, even though there are low birth rates in Korea, in Japan, in China. How is their economy still growing? Well, there's lots of technology, right? You don't just need people. AI and robotics provide great productivity levers. And I think we're going to see going forward that U.S. allies with high-tech focus, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, these are going to become more critical. And of course, other allies that are so critical, like Israel, where cybersecurity is a really critical part of their technological base. That's going to become increasingly important as well. So I think countries that are occupying technological positions of the fulcrum and countries that are on the leading edge or the bleeding edge of technologies, whether it's AI, robotics, microprocessors, semiconductors, smartphones, whatever, all of that's productivity levers. And all of that leads to more growth. And that's why there's such a big race for AI and robotics, because, it doesn't matter how many people you have. To a certain degree, you're able to punch above your weight if you've got more tech boosting you.
Okay. Then looking further ahead, say like over the next 10 years, what do you think will change the most? And what do you expect will remain unchanged?
A lot of things are going to change. You're going to see a lot more tech in a lot more jobs. You're going to see much higher productivity going forward. You're also going to see a prioritization at the national levels, grand strategy for a lot of countries will become increasingly focused on national security and geoeconomic alliance. I think those things change a lot in the next 10 years.
You said a lot more productivity and a lot more jobs.
15 years ago, if you asked someone what they wanted to do out of college, maybe they said they would have wanted to be a consultant. None of them would have said they want to be a social media marketer. It didn't exist yet. But 10 years ago or 7 years ago, you asked someone, what do you want to be when you graduate college? They say, I want to be a social media marketer. And that would have been true 3 years ago. Now, if you ask them, they tell you, I want to work in AI. I want to be an AI coder. I want to be a prompt writer, right? That's right. So what's going to happen in 10 years? More permutations of the technology impacting new jobs that incorporate technology in new and different ways. So that's what really contributes to economic growth, is the technology piece allows for the economy to grow faster than just population dictates. So that's going to be big. And of course, there's AI, which is on the software side, but there's also going to be a need for automation, physical leverage, right? To do the physical work in facilities, in manufacturing, in logistics, supply chain, transportation, material handling, all of that. You're going to see more of that automation going forward. So I see that in the labor force and that in the economy. Some more positive growth driven by lots more technology. And that's why China and the U.S. are kind of in this technological arms race. And because economic security, economic power is one of the big levers of national security. So whoever gets the best technology will have stronger economic power, better economic security, and stronger national security. The second piece is a political prioritization around national security. We are no longer in global peacetime, and at Cold War II, we see the alliance between China and Russia, Iran, North Korea. That's integrating in a rapid way across multiple dimensions: financial, commodity flows, technology transfers, nuclear coordination, all kind of material development and research, right? You see all of those things working together increasingly. And that means if you want to have that credible threat, you want to have effective deterrence, you want containment, just like in Cold War I, which means the countries are going to have to prioritize working together to create a very united front of military and national security to dissuade those countries from being a victim. That's the goal. You don't want to beat them in a war. You don't even want the war to start. That's the goal.
So what do you hope your readers, especially those in Korea, will take away from your book?
I think the most important thing to take away is a way to think about various scenarios in this environment. It's a framework to think about the challenges we're seeing. The data's there showing the coordination between Russia, North Korea, Iran, China. And I would want Korean readers to be prepared for what could be the most important time for conflict risk in history, because there are more countries with nuclear weapons. These are the same parties that we saw in Cold War I. Now they have better technology, better weapons, more weapons, better communication that will require us to work together. And I think I would want Korean readers to take away from this how important this is, and that what's at risk, it looks, in many ways, it looks like it did in the 1920s, that, you have a rising power in Asia that's looking to exert hegemony over Asia. And it's China this time. That China is a real, growing, substantial risk. Military conflict is becoming an increasing risk. And the only way to dissuade that is increased coordination and providing a credible threat to being effectively deterring war.
Okay. Lastly, is there anything you'd especially like to say to your Korean readers?
Yeah, I obviously appreciate the reception of my book in Korea. I think Korea is a very important economy because Korea is just so important for some of the most critical parts of the ICT supply chain, dual-use supply chains, material development and supply chains. I think there are reasons to be optimistic, even if in the moment, the trade disputes with the U.S., right? These are trade negotiations. I think you are, going to see rising tensions in the region going forward. I think the best thing that Korea can do is to continue to be a critical part of the most high-value technological supply chain for its economic growth and opportunity, given the demographic dynamics in Korea. Technology just is going to be everything.
It was a very, very interesting conversation. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you for having me here today. And I thank all my readers in Korea. I hope you all find the book insightful and useful for framing this time of high uncertainty.
Thank you.
오늘의 북인사이트 어떠셨나요? 지금 이 시점에 특히 흥미로운 이야기가 아니었을까 싶은데요. 그럼 스텔라의 북인사이트 다음에도 흥미로운 저자와 함께 찾아오겠습니다. 좋아요, 댓글도 많이 달아주시고요. 우리 여기서도 자주 오래 봐요.